Okay, welcome to part 3 of the climate action series. Right, so for this particular video, we will be looking at how and why climate risks will vary across places. We'll be using certain case examples across the different sections in this area to look at how this climatic risk can actually be worse or can be mitigated naturally by certain situations that the areas we're looking at experience. So let's move on. So when you're looking at climatic risk, there are three main factors that you need to consider. Okay, how climatic risk affects an area. You look at the nature of the hazard itself. You look at the vulnerability of this area, and most importantly, or rather, the third one that you can look at is of course exposure. Okay, so the hazard itself is one thing. Some are more uh, easy to prep for. Some are easier in the sense where there may be a higher lag time before it actually hits you, right? So the not no two climatic related hazards are the same. So the nature of the hazard itself will actually impact the amount of climatic risk you are exposed to. Next, when you're looking at vulnerability of the natural and human systems, right? Some areas are naturally more vulnerable, and because of the larger exposure, be it you have more built up areas to experience damage versus a place that has very little human density, population density, right? So the amount of natural and human systems present will also impact the level of climate risk you're facing. Okay, so this idea of chance of occurrence is important because not every location globally has the same chance of experiencing different climatic related hazards. So imagine this, like we talked about this earlier in the previous video about flooding, about sea level rising, right? If you're not a island nation like Singapore, right? If you're in a major city, but your city is like Beijing is in the middle of nowhere. Okay, I wouldn't say it's in the middle of nowhere, it's in the middle of a very large piece of land, right? So the amount of risk you have from sea level rise is going to be very minimal. Okay, or better still, if your city is on a mountain top or midway up a 3,000 meter elevated relief feature, so your city is at 100 to 1,000 meters above elevation. Okay, then of course your risk with regards to sea level rise is going to be much lower than a city like Singapore, which is at sea level or about 2 meters above sea level and max. Okay, so this is the chance of occurrence, right? Duration of the hazard. Some hazards do last for a longer period of time, and they do present not only short-term immediate damage or risk, which is brought about directly by these hazards, but there are also longer-term sustained damage that the hazard actually brings about. Vulnerability, right? The conditions that help the area be more affected, become more vulnerable. Okay, so these conditions include your community's access to basic facilities like water, food, health, resources, and more importantly, nature systems likelihood to destroy these things. Okay, so if you are very predisposed to having extreme weather conditions and you have very little access to water, imagine when there's flooding, right? Flooding and water, right? You may be thinking, oh, there must be something wrong here, but flood water is not something that's consumable. So if you really have very little water and there's flooding, your original freshwater sources may get polluted, and as a result, you have even lesser water. Okay, so take a minute, let that sink in first. Think about it. If you already have uh, issues with certain conditions towards sustainable or even towards sustaining your life, okay, things like water, food, and medical care, you already don't have a lot of this, and something happens. Will you be worse hit versus somebody else who is living in a city which has all these things in abundance? Right. So if you do have a cutoff in some of these things, then maybe the impact on that other person will be a lot less. Exposure, once again, this has got to do with what I mentioned earlier about comparing Beijing and Singapore, right? So proximity of your community towards these areas, right? Be it a very dry area or coastal environments. Now you will recurringly see these two types of areas. dry areas and coastal environments being flagged out when we're looking at climatic risk. Because if you are in a dry area, right, let's go back to the previous slide here. What will your access to these three key things be lacking in? If you're in a dry area, water access will be tough. If you are in a coastal area, you are at risk of sea level rising. And sea level rising is something that has been bothering communities, coastal communities, in recent memory. Okay, and it will continue because as global warming continues, right, the amount of fresh water that is dumped into the sea, due to your melting of the ice caps, the glaciers, this will continue to increase, and as a result, you will have sea level rising continue. So we come back to our formula here, right? For those of you who like formulas, I don't know why you're like that, but for those of you who like formulas, this formula tells you that if you want to mitigate against climatic risk, you cannot just deal with one. Okay, you want to effectively mitigate against it, you need to deal with more than one of these three factors. Okay, right? You cannot take it in isolation. It doesn't come as one thing. Right? You need to deal with all three of them, all three factors. So this video here is about what happened when Hurricane Katrina actually impacted New Orleans in America. Right? The impact of Katrina on New Orleans is not even on the entire city, because New Orleans is a big city, right? And the amount of elevation, the amount of access uh, to the various resources that we talked about a couple slides ago is different. So this video will clearly show you the variation in this. So please watch the video, and then we can think about the question. Okay, so after you watch the video, or while you're watching the video, it's useful that for you to keep this in your mind, right? Uh, as you watch the impact of Katrina on New Orleans, right? What are some factors that lead to uneven climatic risk across different places? Is it economical? Is it relief? Is it because of locational issues? Uh, then think about how it actually, this issue, this factor, led to it being a more or less serious outcome, because depending on what area you have actually picked up, or what factor you've actually picked up, certain areas actually had a less impactful outcome when Katrina hit. Okay, but bear in mind, Katrina is a bad deal. When it hit, everybody in New Orleans was affected in some way or other. Even the very, very rich, there was inconvenience because your roads, your transport system, transport networks, power grids were all affected. The very rich may not have lost power, they may not have lost water, but it would have been at a lower efficiency level because the infrastructure itself was very badly hit. Okay, so think about this as you watch the video. Why is it that certain areas have more damage, some have less damage? Okay, how is it that that factor that allowed them to do this? Okay, how did it mitigate against, or how did it accentuate the impact of Katrina? So we will stop here for this very, very short video, and then we will continue with the next section.